What it would have been on rate cuts if the current turmoil hadn't arisen, would it have still been 2024 in terms of bringing it back, bringing it the other direction?
Yeah. I think so. We haven't changed our view, even though we've taken up the peak, our projected peak in the terminal rate. We haven't changed where we think our best guess is where the bank will start to cut. The reason for that is very simple. We are of the camp that thinks that inflation will be a little bit more persistent. And there's two parts of this puzzle. So there's the peak in inflation, which we think has been brought forward and lowered by the energy price guarantee, which is good. The kind of flip side of that is that we do see core inflation being a little bit more persistent over the next 12 months. And so for us to have confidence at this stage, and there could be lots of things that would change our view over the next few months. We've certainly been ping-ponged along with the markets. But at this juncture, where we see core inflation, where we see headline inflation, so we expect headline inflation next year to be about 7%, a little over 7%. We think that would limit what the Bank of England will be willing to do in terms of unwinding policy tightening until at least early 2024.
Okay, thank you. So I've got questions on spending cuts in the medium-term fiscal plan, but I just wanted to pick up on the points that were made earlier. So the Bank of England's, is the Bank of England sending a message to government as vis-a-vis yesterday's intervention, having had to intervene to prevent the mini budget's implication being that $1 trillion could have been erased from the UK pension funds, that the government, it's over to the government now, they can't fix this through their instruments. Is that essentially what the bank's also signalling, along with a direct message?
They're trying to say clearly, it's our job to intervene to resolve market dysfunction. It's not our job to intervene to reduce risk premia, which you have just put up, basically. And then they're trying to navigate how you implement that in policy terms, and there is a tension when it comes to long-term rates right now, for obvious reasons that we've all been discussing. So I think that is how they would phrase the difficult path they are trying to tread. And that's more or less what the chief economist said to you, and the letter from the deputy governor also set out.
Okay, everyone agreed on that. And would it be, just going on to spending cuts, would it be credible for the Chancellor to try and stabilise debt using spending restraints only in order to get debt falling as a share of GDP? I know you've touched on some of this already, but who would like to kick off?
Well, I think when it comes to stabilising debt, he's looking 4 or 5 years out. So making promises now about spending cuts in 4 or 5 years, when after an election, I think will be worth remarkably little, actually, to creating credibility, particularly given that we know that over the next 3 years spending will be rising much slower than was intended a year ago, given that everyone knows that the pressures on the health service are such that we're going to struggle to keep to current budgets, let alone cut them. We've got a Prime Minister who's committed to spending another 30 billion or so on defence. And the period we've been through with very big cuts over the last decade. But I think the key here is, Sanjay made the point earlier, that it's, if you just make a series of promises about what might happen in 4 or 5 years' time with some either unspecified or very hard to believe spending cuts, and you don't do anything up front, it's not going to be a signal to the markets that this is a government that's taking this as seriously as the markets want to see.
Did anyone else want to come in?
I think we didn't quite answer the chair's question right at the beginning, so I think it's worth spelling out. What does a vague way through this look like? It doesn't look like long distance. You can have your tax cuts today, and I'm going to pencil in some pain tomorrow in ways I can't show you, and any way which people won't believe is credible because they have actually lived through the last 12 years, and don't think that it is easy to cut public spending on current budgets today as it was in 2010, and they'll be right. So I think we should place almost, I think I'm totally with Paul, and we're also being told, one of the things we've learned since the government announced it was going to have a fiscal consolidation plan, is that there's not much appetite, even on the Conservative benches, for significant cuts in benefits via up-ratings, which is the way you would plausibly make large cuts in benefits in a high inflation environment. The idea that we're going to make lots of changes to actual entitlements and things during this phase seems, all of which would require primary legislation seems like it would be pushing political credibility, given that half the cabinet has decided to be on the record as saying they don't support them. So you have got a problem, which is on the spending side, the thing that looks credible, and history tells us is basically credible, is cutting investment spending.
Yep.
That is the thing that's credible, and so that will end up taking a large part of the strain, and is higher than it has been in the last 30 years, so that's a very likely target. So, and then you're just doing the thing that would make is the worst outcome for growth is the thing that's credible, which is why this is hard. But this all takes you back to, and you're going to set yourself loose-ish fiscal rules to make this feel like it's vaguely plausible. But then you basically do need to end up U-turning on more of these tax cuts. Because, and I think actually the thing to think about is it's not just that it makes the arithmetic add up. It's that it gives you credibility because you are taking some pain. The markets are being told, okay, I've listened, I've learnt, and that is where you're going to get credibility from. It's not from, yes, it helps appointing the right Treasury Perm Sec, it helps that you're involving the OBR rather than ignoring them. But given where we are in a very serious situation, I don't think there is a plausible, credible package that's going to work on the 31st now that doesn't involve U-turning on more of these, because markets are going to need to see that the government is saying, I've changed course.
Through which, all of the tax cuts or some? What would be?
You can probably make these numbers out, but I mean, so the most likely that I'd have thought that we'll see a further U-turn is on the corporation tax position, because it's the easiest to do and because you all voted on the national insurance rise yesterday, and there's a cross-party consensus on that because of the path dependency of how we've got to where we have got to. So, I mean, but you all know more than me what the politics of that is. But yeah, I would focus on the corporation tax. It is obviously mad that we're spending £2 billion allowing people to avoid the tax they should be paying for the self-employed via the exchange. It's taken us, I mean, one of my first ever jobs in the Treasury was trying to deal with some tax avoidance. This IR35 issue was a large part of the problem then. It then took us a decade to put in place a, yes, complicated, but vaguely suitable to the scale of the challenge we faced regime. And we're now spending £2 billion. We're giving £2 billion to people to let them avoid or evade tax. It's completely unhinged. So that, I have no strong view on the net benefit of providing lower VAT for some tourists, but is that the core of our growth agenda, or could we possibly have some tourists paying a bit of VAT so that we don't have a massive fiscal and monetary headache? I'd have thought so. So little ones we should just obviously not be going ahead with. On the big ones, then it is going to be corporation tax and possibly the basic rate that are in play. And if you don't look at these things, I think we should be honest, we are cruising to be announcing a non-credible package on the 31st, and that is the last thing we should be doing because of the international regime we've been talking about and because of what we've just done to ourselves over the last 2 weeks. Because I would like us not to be the poster child for how difficult economic policy can be in the 2020s going into November, which is what we currently are.
I hope my Tory colleagues on this committee can persuade our Chancellor to listen to some of this feedback. So did anyone else want to come in on this?
Just briefly, Mike. Where it's right ultimately to focus on debt to GDP and stabilise it for the reasons we talked about a few minutes ago, in the end, debt and deficits are just instruments to bring about an economic objective. Now, we have an economic objective that's been described as 2.5% growth. I think we've got some severe question marks about how sensible that is and how achievable it is and over what horizon it should be achievable. But to make a statement that it's a good idea to get towards increasing prosperity for all is probably a good way of guiding government policy. So I think what we want to see alongside any statement about changes in government expenditure, and I'd be very concerned if we started to rein in public investment. It's temporarily high, but over the 40-year stretch since 1979, it's been far below the 3% that we think we need as a post-industrial economy.
So, and what else does the Chancellor need to restore credibility for the medium term?
Well, I think we've
talked about
I think we need statements about the kind of interventions and the impact. I'll just wait. The kind of interventions we need to help growth, the horizon over which they'll work, the parts of the country that will benefit, in a way that we can measure the tangible progress over time and ask ourselves whether we're getting any nearer towards that. That would be part of a credible package towards growth in the economy, not just focusing constantly on the debt or the deficit. We need to think carefully about what are the outcomes that result from that reflect the preferences of people, as we said earlier, in terms of greater health, education, infrastructure expenditure, but also in generating better well-being across, or higher levels of well-being across the country. That is also part of it, as well as the statements on changing expenditure, a proper way of tracking progress in these areas. It's just all too nebulous at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think
So-
that's what we'd like to see more of.
Yeah, and then just finally, departmental spending was set a year ago. Inflation was just over 4%, and the cash settlements are they? They're presumably they're not obviously very realistic in light of what's happening. What do you see as being the challenges of the government going down this sort of austerity 2.0 route? And we haven't talked about, I don't think, apologies if I missed it, welfare spending and the earnings rather than prices debate. What are your thoughts on those? Because obviously earlier you've talked about areas that could be dumped, but there are obviously other areas where there's real pressure, and there isn't. It seems there's not going to be political support for a reversal of commitments that have been made. Any thoughts on those points?
Well, Jim and Paul should come on the public spending, and I can come on the uprating.
On the public service spending side, as you say, budgets were set last September when inflation was expected to be quite a lot lower than we now think it is. So those budgets, which were initially expected to be quite generous, and particularly generous this year, the plan was to increase public service spending by 3.3% in real terms over the current spending review period. That now looks like it could be less than half that, maybe 1.5% real terms increases over that period because of higher inflation. And that means that departments are already having to spend more than they had expected on public sector pay, for example, with the sort of roughly 4 to 5% settlements that we saw this summer compared to more like 2% that was probably factored into those budget plans. They're not as exposed as households to things like energy costs, but departments do spend a sizable chunk of their budgets on those. They're obviously facing higher costs there as well. And it's pretty clear that they're struggling to get on top of the backlogs, that a lot of that extra funding was intended to try and tackle some of the backlogs coming out of the pandemic, and it's pretty clear that that's already not happening to the extent that was hoped for in the health service, in the criminal court system, for example. So what was the aspiration for last year's spending review is already looking like it can't be delivered within the existing budget. So if you wanted to take money out of services in the next few years, you'd have to be thinking about the scope of the services offered. It's not the sorts of other levers you might have hoped for that we've used in the past decade, like holding down pay or so-called efficiency savings, trying to do things differently. There's not a lot of evidence that those are credible ways forward. On the pay side, obviously we've already seen quite a lot of industrial action, and public sector pay is going up, expected to go up more quickly over the next, private sector pay is expected to go up more quickly, so sort of outside options for other workers may increase recruitment and retention problems.
Thank you. I think you wanted to come in quickly.
I was going to, so on uprating, I agree with everything Jim said, which is why I think people won't interpret current budget cuts being penciled in for 4 years out on the back of that as particularly credible. But that's the question on day-to-day spending. On benefits, I think it is clearly deliverable to implement a lower uprating of benefits this year, possibly next year in the 2 high inflation years. The politics, obviously you all know better than me, but is difficult. That there is one area of benefits, so we've ruled out basically lower ratings for pensions. You would need a vote to lower the uprating below prices for disability benefits and a few other areas, which is a large chunk. So we're basically here talking about universal credit and its predecessor benefits, with a few additions. Child benefit is the other big one, where you can lower up ratings without a vote necessarily in the House of Commons. There'll be a vote, but not one that would actually be able to stop it going ahead. That would save you in the region of £3 billion. So broadly, big cuts to benefits for working age households is the price for letting people avoid their self-employment tax, broadly. Same kind of ballpark in terms of things. Is it a good idea? I mean, clearly not. So the Treasury would save £3 billion if you went with a 5.5% earnings-related uprating rather than a 10% inflation-related uprating. The effect of that is a £500 permanent hit to the incomes of working single parents with one child, around £1,000 for a working couple with 3 children. Obviously, when working families would lose most because the combination of child benefit and universal credit from these kinds of, particularly if you also freeze the work allowances in universal credit. So that's where the big numbers will start coming through. And it's really important we should just step back and think about what's the context. The context is big falls in living standards for everybody next year. And because our inflation uprating system is lagged, even if we went ahead with a full inflation uprating in April, the actual level of benefits on average over the course of next year would still be 6% below its real level in 1920. So it's still going to feel tough because we're waiting for the next uprating next year to catch us back up here, because every year we're kind of playing catch up. And this year we're not playing catch-up in quite the same way because the government's is adding these one-off payments, these energy support payments to people on lower incomes, but those disappear out of this year, and it's the inflation uprating that basically one-for-one replaces those. If we don't go ahead of that uprating, we're talking about really significant falls in incomes for lower income households next year, and it would mean benefits being at their lowest real level in 4 decades, 40 years, and the economy has grown quite a lot during that time. So I think on the substance, is next year a good time to be holding down benefits in terms of prices? No, for the reasons I've set out about it being a difficult time. Would it save you some money? Yes, around £3 billion. I can list you other ways of finding that money.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rushanara. Emma.
Thanks very much, and I do have to say we're definitely not